my colleague Stephen Martin for another episode of Sports and Compliance. Today we're going to take up something that I will only call an imbroglio involving the U.S. men's national soccer team. So, Stephen, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Always great to be here.
So, Stephen, this sordid tale has lots of compliance angles, business angles, and sports angles, but I'm going to let you set it up for us.
All right. So, what we're going to talk about here today, folks, is we want to talk about what happened with the U.S. men's national soccer team coming out of the World Cup. For those of you that are soccer or football fans and watch this closely, you'll know exactly what happened. And for those that maybe don't pay attention quite as closely, we wanted to run through it for you. The U.S. men's national team in soccer was playing in the World Cup in Qatar, recently this winter. The U.S. team had high expectations in terms of getting out of their group and playing well. And part of the team was a young, pretty dynamic soccer player midfielder who wanted to. Who I think the U.S. team thought would be, potentially a big young star in this World Cup, and his name was Gio Reyna. And his family has been very involved in soccer. His father, Claudio Reyna, played on the U.S. men's national team and was one of the early stars. And so coming into the World Cup, he was one that was projected to get a lot of playing time. Going to be one of the young stars, one of the focuses for the U.S. national team. As the tournament got underway in the first game, he did not play and did not start, and which came as a surprise. And as they moved through pool play, Gio Reyna was not a really active participant or getting much playing time, which surprised people. After that fact, and as the team moved through into the knockout stage tournament, there was some question about why wasn't he playing? Was he injured? And not too much information really came out. But it did sort of leak out that potentially Gio Reyna had not been training very hard, was not very focused, much more of kind of the prima donna attitude, and it didn't sit well with the coaches or the other teammates. In fact, there was a discussion among the coaching staff to actually remove him from the World Cup and send him home, which would be kind of an unprecedented action, not only for the U.S. men's national team, but for any national teams. When players are at that level and trying to play in their World Cup, especially when you're young, like he was playing their first World Cup, it's kind of shocking to see somebody that seemed disinterested in training and wasn't focused. Subsequent to the exit from the World Cup at the hands of Netherlands, the U.S. team departed Qatar. There were still questions about why wasn't Gio Reyna part of that. Greg Burkhalter, the head coach for the men's national team, had addressed those in the media and then was speaking at a conference and did not name the player individually, but talked about the decision among the team that this player was struggling to train, was not really being part of the team, and the coaching staff talked about, in fact, sending him home. That information was relayed around the world. It became very quick for people to figure out who the head coach was talking about. Subsequent to that, there was some information that came to the U.S. men's national team headquarters and to the leadership there that had discussed potentially that Greg Burkhalter had been involved in a domestic violence incident at some point. U.S. men's national team and U.S. soccer instituted an internal investigation and looked into the situation. But what became very interesting about it, and of course, domestic violence is a very serious issue and should be taken very seriously, but it turns out that Gio Reyna's mother, Danielle Reyna, is the one that had been the whistleblower and turned in this information to the U.S. men's national team and U.S. soccer because she was upset with Greg Burkhalter not only benching her son, but more important, publicly calling him out, even though he didn't use his name, and talking about his lack of effort during training. This incident that Danielle Reyna had raised to U.S. soccer was an incident that had happened 30 years prior, or plus 30 plus years prior, when Greg Burkhalter, his now wife, and Danielle Reyna were all undergrad students and freshmen at the University of North Carolina playing soccer together. The incident, as it was alleged in the media, involved a dispute between Greg Burkhalter and his wife, at which point it became a heated discussion, and Greg kicked his wife at that point. And while that situation is if true, deplorable. And I think the Burkhalters have both stepped into the media and have said that the situation did occur, that it was a very difficult time for them. They broke up as a couple for about 7 months, but then ultimately came back together and have spent 30 years together in a relationship, married, have kids, and at least by appearances seem to have never had any similar issues other than when they were back in college and 18, more than 30 years ago. So, what Tom and I wanted to discuss was kind of some of the lessons learned from this situation. And again, we're not going to really focus on the domestic violence issue. We all know that that is of critical importance. It absolutely should always be investigated. It should never happen, and people should face consequences for those actions. But what we really wanted to talk about is, from a compliance perspective, what happens when you have a whistleblower, question, when you have to investigate those situations? What happens when, it's made in, potentially bad faith, or made to hurt another person or a family in this situation, or to retaliate against some kind of other actions? And, how do you deal with those situations? So with that, Tom, that's kind of the buildup as to the factual underpinnings here. And so let's talk about it a little bit from the compliance standpoint.
So you really laid out, I think, some of the key elements, Stephen. And the first one I would really like to explore is the whistleblower and the information from the whistleblower. I think we all agree bystander whistleblowers are a critical part of a whistleblower program and should be incorporated. But all whistleblower claims have to be made in good faith, meaning there's a good faith belief that the event happened and that there's a legitimate reason for doing so. Here it appears there's no legitimate reason for doing so. The event, the Burkhalters acknowledged the event. Greg Burkhalter himself not only apologized publicly, but he detailed some of the steps he took to remediate himself. He went to therapy. Right. He reconciled with his wife. I don't know if he promised never to do it again, but there's no public record of him ever doing it again. This was not done to protect Greg's wife. It was done to spite Greg by Gio Reyna's mother. It's unclear if Gio Reyna himself was involved in the decision. Claudio Reyna has tried to distance himself from this, but it is his wife who made this allegation. So there's a lot to unpack there. I guess we have to start with the motivation of the whistleblower. Right. Is that a area for legitimate inquiry going forward?
Yes. So, look, as a compliance officer, in my job currently, and I think, most of the folks that might be listening to this, when you have whistleblower policies or reporting hotline policies, they almost always will say that reports need to be made in good faith. And most of that is around being protected in terms of retaliation, meaning you won't get the protection under, the non-retaliation policy of a company if you reported something in bad faith. But also, I think it's a critical part in terms of the investigation to understand, what situation you have and what, the discipline should be. In this situation, clearly you had a domestic situation between Greg Burkhalter and Rosalind now Burkhalter, but it also happened 35 years ago, and they certainly had handled it themselves. Like you said, he'd gone to therapy, they had separated, but they came back together and, by all accounts, seemed to have a successful marriage with kids. And, what Danielle Reyna decided to do was she was upset with somebody. She was upset with Greg Burkhalter not playing her son in the World Cup. And so instead of handling that through what would be the normal proper channels and to address it with US Soccer, she decided to, for whatever reasons, to potentially destroy another family, right? She wanted to destroy Greg's career. She wanted to make sure that this was public. It's not an issue that she raised when he was first hired by US Men's Soccer. It wasn't an issue that she's raised over the years. It was raised as a direct result because she was unhappy, with his coaching decisions. And to me, that's very much in bad faith. I think the sad part of all of this is, obviously don't know Gio Reyna, but what coach would want to coach him or put him on a men's national team if you have parents that are like this? What I had heard along the way and what has been reported is Claudio Reyna maybe didn't report this, but he was very active at the World Cup and kind of aggressively going to the U.S. soccer leadership and trying to undermine the coach because of the lack of playing time for his son, as opposed to addressing potentially the underlying issue where his son simply wasn't very interested in training with the team, or really getting onto the field. So to me, when you look at investigations, I always try to understand, why is something being reported, who reported it, and is it done in good faith? And clearly in this circumstance, it was not done in good faith. But U.S. Soccer still had to deal with it.
So U.S. Soccer dealt with it by hiring external counsel to do an investigation. Many of the events that we've talked about so far were already in the public arena, and Greg Burkhalter did acknowledge those publicly, so we're able to know at least his version of what happened going forward. How would you, Stephen, as an external counsel, um, would you simply do the investigation to determine whether the allegations were true and turn it over to the client or potential client to leave it to them to try to decide discipline, if any? Would you look at the client's um, policies and procedures around discipline? Is there, I was trying to rack my brain for some guidance, policy and procedure wise, for an event 30 years ago that was relatively well known under similar to this set of facts, and I couldn't come up with one. Every company has a disciplinary process up to and including discharge. How would you help a client kind of think through those issues?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising the broader investigation issue and how do you handle them, right? As an outside counsel in this kind of situation, your job really is to determine the facts, and what you're tasked with doing is gathering the evidence, gathering, any information you can, conducting interviews, making assessments um, about veracity and about the reasons why certain things are done. But at the end of the day, your report is going back to the client in a factual way, right? We don't generally make determinations about discipline or what should happen. There are times when clients will ask you that, and you try to give them your view of what are the ranges of possibilities here and outcomes. What's the most likely outcome for corporations if you had similar situation? Now this one's a little different, right? But and you can give them some of that guidance, but at the end of the day, they have to factor in a lot of different things. Reputational impact, what the employee's been like in the organization, what have they done for discipline in similar situations, and they really get to make that call. And so I often will leave that to the client. I'm happy to discuss it with them, but I don't make recommendations on what do you need to do from a disciplinary standpoint. It
Let me
changes a
move.
little bit. It changes a little bit if you're in-house as opposed to outside and you're conducting this, right? Because you will often get more involved in the potentially disciplinary discussions.
Let me change the focus just a little bit, Stephen. You've been in a locker room or clubhouse. You have a daughter who's in a locker room. So
Yeah.
you're a soccer dad. You've been a college athlete. What do you think something like this does to the locker room?
Oh, I think it's, look, there's probably different components of it, right? So what Gio Reyna did by refusing to train, not working hard, being a prima donna, it was very much negatively impacting the team. So much so that the coaches discussed sending him home, right? And that's a major step in the biggest international competition in soccer. To potentially send home one of your players from a limited roster and you can't replace them, that's a big step. And that's how bad his actions were at the end of the day. So that was clearly having a negative impact on the team. Then when you get into the situation of, parents behind the scenes pushing the coaches, pushing the leadership, trying to suggest that they know better than the coach, that's the fastest way to, cause problems. A good coach won't listen to it at all. And a good coach will be very clear about, this is not your role or job. And I'm not going to have this discussion with you. Right. And no matter how famous Claudio Reyna was with the U.S. men's national team and being involved in U.S. soccer, which he is, you still have to take that approach as a coach. Otherwise, you will lose the locker room. Right. If you let a parent influence you in terms of, your child playing on the field, which is completely, then you lose the team. Burkhalter credit, he was here, right? Because there were expectations for the team to try and move to the next step in world soccer. He wants to be the men's national team coach. His contract was about to expire. He was having to bench a young star because of the young star's own actions as opposed to coaching decisions. He didn't want to do that. The kid was supposed to be a big time player for the U.S. And having to deal behind the scenes during the tournament, with parents that were so intense that they were causing him problems during the tournament. I mean, it's just, you'd like to say it's unprecedented, but it happens in all levels. My view as a college athlete and somebody who's been in that locker room is, unless you're on the team, you don't have the right to speak to the coach about coaching decisions. As a parent, you can't do that. If I went up, my daughter's going to be playing at the University of Michigan, right? And if I went to either one of her coaches on either team and suggested to them about my daughter's playing time, they they should have a very serious conversation with me about what my role is and what the expectations are. More important, I think it could directly impact my daughter, and I would never do it. I mean, it's completely inappropriate. And when you say you've got parents who are doing something completely inappropriate at a world stage, and then because they didn't get things handled the way they wanted to, they tried to destroy another family, it's pretty amazing facts.
So, what would you advise U.S. soccer right now?
Yeah. So before I answer that, the other piece of information I didn't put out there was that Danielle Reina and Rosalind Burkhalter were best friends before this, right? They were soccer teammates at the University of North Carolina. That's why she knew this facts. They've been best friends. The whole families have been best friends for long periods of time in their lives. And she still chose to do it to her best friend, which is just shocking. And so it's interesting to watch, what motivates people and why they make decisions. On U.S. soccer, look, I think it's a difficult situation. Obviously, they had to investigate it. Two of their senior leaders who would make this decision just left U.S. soccer, right? And they were two of Greg Burkhalter's actual teammates along the way. So they're having a lot of leadership transition. At the same time, they have to make a decision on Greg in terms of moving forward with the men's national team. I think coming out of the World Cup, the assumption was probably that he would get rehired because his contract expired at the end of the year. But because these facts came out right at the end of the year, they have not renewed his contract. And I think the speculation now is that he will lose the position as the U.S. men's national team in most part because of these allegations that were made. Look, I don't condone what he did, but I can also see that he was 18 years old and it was 35 years ago, and his wife it's been very clear that, this happened, we handled it, and it's never happened since then. And we have a happy life and marriage. And, so I would hope that you would evaluate him really as a soccer coach, as opposed to what the Reinas tried to do to him at the end of the day. But as we all know, reputation matters. Things that you've done in your life can come back at any point and surface, and you never know when they're going to come from, which is a good reason why you always try to do things the right way. We all make mistakes. But you got to be smart about it because these things keep coming up. We certainly have seen it in, kind of the sexual harassment, Me Too stuff that has happened out there, and certainly while people deserve it, somebody like Greg who, handled the situation, appropriately and seemed to have dealt with it, and now is getting, his life negatively impacted by people who just wanted some revenge, is a really tough situation for U.S. soccer. So I think they'll walk away from him and they'll hire a different coach. I would hope at the end of the day it was really made on soccer decisions versus this controversy.
There were really a lot of interesting and even difficult compliance angles from this. We're going to link to the article that Stephen sent me that appeared in the The Athletic, which really detailed all of these facts that we based this discussion on. And I would encourage everyone to read the article for themselves, but think about how you would handle these issues in your compliance program. Are you set up to not simply intake, but also evaluate a report, investigate the report, and then act on a report when you take into account the motivations of a report not made in good faith? So a lot to unpack here, Stephen.
Yep. No, there is a lot to unpack, and I do think it gives us some really interesting material. And I agree that folks should read this article, especially if they love soccer, but just generally as compliance folks, because this would be a very challenging situation to handle. But these kind of things do pop up, and that's why it's important to conduct a thorough investigation. That's why it's important to have kind of reasonable and deliberate discussions about all of the factors that go into something before you decide the outcome on this. Because you are affecting people's lives, and there are very serious situations that need to be addressed with terminating people. And then there's other situations where doing the right thing is not necessarily the expedient terminating them, but trying to stand up. And in this case, when somebody really makes a claim in bad faith, trying to injure another person, I would hope that would be addressed. Like I said, I don't think there's probably any outcome for Danielle and Claudio Reyna, to really for making a claim in bad faith, but employees get fired for those kinds of things, right? And so you make a whistleblower hotline complaint in bad faith, that can be something you can get terminated for. Like I said, I think the outcome is, she lost her best friend for sure, and she may well have cost her son, any real chances of playing for, clubs or teams, because I'm not sure what coach wants to face those parents, because clearly they will go to steps that most people wouldn't, to address a situation.
Most people think the soccer mom ends when you finish playing amateur soccer. Guess what?
Right. Or 12-year-old soccer, not even
Or
amateur, right?
12-year-old
No,
soccer.
there's no question. It is a good learning experience for all the parents that are out there that have athletes. We all care about our kids. We all get super into the games, but you got to keep it on the rails. Like, you got to understand that it's not the end of the world, and maybe your kid did something that caused the problem as well. It's not always just the coach.
Well, Stephen, this was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot, and I can't wait till we come up with next time.
Yep, it'll be a fun. I'm sure we'll find some topic to talk about. So, but always great